Hi, we continue in Genesis 33 today after Jacob and Esau have met, and as we saw last time, Jacob is a little hesitant so far in accepting that his brother Esau is sincerely there to reconcile. As we saw last time, Esau came and ran to him and embraced him and kissed him, just like the prodigal son's father in Luke 15, and yet it doesn't say that Jacob kissed him. It's all the action is on Esau's part. And as we'll see today, Jacob is rather slyly being Jacob, whether he's being a trickster or just being indirect. He's still apparently hesitant to reunite with his brother Esau. And this may tell us as much about Israel and Edom as it does about anything else, about two different peoples and their distrust with each other, and especially we might imagine it in our world where Israelis and Palestinians or other related groups find themselves separated, and reconciliation would be beneficial for everybody, but it depends upon the terms in which that happens. So many examples of that, both in Israel's history and in Jewish history then and now, as well as the history, obviously, of many other peoples. So here we are in the last part of our Jacob and Esau story. We're in the reunion section here, and as I've been noting throughout this chapter, and chapter 32, there's a number of both intratextual references and word plays, and today we're going to focus on the intratextual plays down here, so we'll have a little different chart to look at that in a minute. We're also looking now at the second of the two chiasms that begin this section. This is 1 through 7, and this is 8 through 11. And the part afterward that we'll look at next time is not chiastic in that same way. But this is a very nice, clean chiasm. You can see the top has Esau saying, "I have enough," and the second echoing part, Jacob says, "I have everything I want." There's the please, please accept my present, and please accept my blessing. But in the middle is the key part, Jacob saying to Esau, "For truly to see your face is like seeing the face of God." And that will trigger all kinds of intratextual echoes, both to earlier in the Jacob and Esau story, but all the way back to Cain and Abel, as we'll see. So I'd like to start our story by just walking through this. We're only looking at 4 verses today, but what you can see in the blue is the text of our passage, and in between are references back to other parts of Genesis, either because of the story as a reference back, or because a particular word is a link in a way that is almost certainly meant to be connected, because the words are used rarely outside of the connecting places here. So I'll go back and forth to the left side to look at some of the Hebrew words, but we can also just follow it here on the right side. So just to go back a verse to see where we were, the women and children come near, and Joseph and Rachel last, and they all bow down. So here's Esau's response, and that note is just showing the chiasm I just showed you. "What do you mean by all this company that I met?" is an odd way to translate something. It's actually very difficult to translate. The phrase "mi leka" means "why are these?" And the company here, there's an interesting play on words that a number of people have mentioned. We saw in chapter 32 that the company, as my note here has, refers back to the messages that Jacob sent with the messengers to divide up the animals and the people into groups, to spread them out in sequence. But Esau is plainly referring to the company here to the animals. All that was said ahead of him, and Jacob's answer to find favor underscores that, because plainly Jacob wouldn't say that all of his 4 women and all his 11 children are there to find favor with Esau. So this is referring to the animals. And notice how this is a different question than Jacob anticipated. Esau is asking the why question. Translated by "what do you mean?" maybe connotes that, but what is the point of you sending me 550 animals? And Jacob's response is to find favor with my Lord. And I didn't note to find favor as a key word, although it's a couple of times here. Literally, it's to find favor in your eyes. And I didn't put as a key word because it's only a few times, but it's certainly connected to what we've seen as the face and the hand theme, where body parts express relationship and power, the power of the hand, but also intimacy, to see face to face, as we already saw once and we're going to see again now. Part of Jacob's hesitation is expressed in his still calling him my Lord, referring to him in the third person. Esau responds with "my brother." But Jacob does not call him brother. Jacob is still not sure that this is authentic. And we have to, in fairness to Jacob's interpretation here, he hasn't seen his brother in over 20 years. The last time he heard about him, Esau was plotting to get revenge by planning to kill him. And Jacob has no reason to know that Esau's life has been okay. We don't see Esau's family here, apparently. We just see 400 men who seem to be soldiers. But he has no family here, even though later in Genesis we'll see he certainly does have children. And we already heard that he had wives. the Canaanite wives that displeased Isaac and Rebekah, and almost certainly triggered the plan to send Jacob back to the old country to find a wife from Rebekah's family. So Jacob is still hesitant to trust that Esau is sincere here, that his hug and his kiss really mean that he's not bearing any ill will. And so to find favor, excuse the little typo there, I'll fix that before I post it at radicalbible.net. We're calling Abraham, saying to the visitors in chapter 18. And that's one of a couple references back to that story of chapter 18 and 19. We might note that that story also had ambiguous visitors, whether they were men or angels or God, which also is resonant with what we just saw in the previous chapter with Jacob's wrestling with whoever that was. So Abraham had said to those visitors, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant," which is not that different than here, speaking of servant at the language, and here Lord, if he was speaking of himself as a servant, which he's done several times. So certainly an echo there. But Esau's response is perhaps surprising and really leads us to look back at what I've been noting all along since chapter 25 and chapter 27 with the birthright and blessing, that the human blessing was meaningless, that the division between the family that happened because Esau was so jealous of Jacob playing Esau and stealing the blessing had no consequence whatsoever. And Genesis is making a big point here, that the only blessing that matters comes from Yahweh. Yahweh is the only one who has power over fertility. And we recall Jacob saying that back in chapter 30 when Rachel said, "Give me children or I'll die," and he said, "Am I in the place of God?" as you can see here. So even Jacob knew that only God can control fertility of the human body, of animals, of the earth, or anything else that can bring forth life. So Esau is saying, "I have enough" here, and we'll look at the wordplay on that in a minute, shows that the blessing, the lack of a blessing, did not prevent him from having whatever he needs. We don't know what that enough is, but he simply describes it simply as Rav. And Rav is an interesting word to have as a play here. We can see it here. When he says, "I have Rav," that we've seen 3 examples of it. I didn't put the verse note here, but this is from 25:13. Again, I'll put that in before I post it. I'm sorry for those mistakes. Back to the oracle, 2 nations are in your womb, and their Rav was elder. The word basically means numerous or more of, so elder in the sense of more years. But here, in the very blessing that we've just shown is meaningless, we saw it there where Isaac to Jacob as Esau offered plenty of grain, rav of grain, abundance of grain. And whether Jacob has had grain and wine, we have not seen that he has any grain and wine. We've seen that he has lots of animals. Any event, Isaac's saying that does not have any influence on whether it happens. In the same way that your words to your children or your siblings or whoever does not mean that those things happen. It simply means you care about them and you wish them well. But we do not have the power to make fertility happen. So then one more example of it, Jacob to Laban saying, "For you, Laban, had little before I came, and it is increased," there's Rav again, "abundantly, and Yahweh has blessed you." Here Jacob is playing into Laban's sense of material abundance as blessing, linking back to the camels in chapter 24, and certainly he'd been prepped on that. So that's not to say that's the Bible's or Genesis's view about what blessing is, but Laban's view that he's playing into. So many variations on Rav here, as enough years, as enough grain, as just enough in general, as Esau says here. Calling him my brother. And echoing Jacob back to there, and echoing, curiously, Laban back in 29:15, who called Jacob brother, but in the broad sense of being family members, not literally siblings. And yet Laban hardly acted like a brother to Esau, hardly acted as a brother to Jacob. And maybe it's some of the memory of Laban in his mind that has Jacob concerned about Esau's sincerity. Because after all, Laban welcomed him as well, although not as generously and as unconditionally as Esau, if we recall that scene where he said, after a little bit, "Just because you're my family, should I make you work for nothing?" and basically hired him. So having said, "I have enough, my brother," he says, "Keep what you have for yourself." And again, this is a phrase that's difficult to translate. Lakah has to... I won't even try. This is probably as good a way to translate it as any, since it's difficult. But as Sarna notes, beneath the surface meaning lies perhaps Esau's final concession of the birthright. That nothing has happened to make Jacob have an advantage over Esau here. And yet, curiously, Jacob insists. And we have to look at why the insisting. Why is Jacob insisting? And as a couple of scholars noted, perhaps the key is in the Cain and Abel story, although Jacob wouldn't know the Cain and Abel story, but we as readers do, so we can hear the echoes. So let's look first at what he says. He says, no please, and notice from the key words, all the pleases here. Literally, this is, oh please, no please, or no please twice. So he's making a strong insistence here. For things like that where it seems like somebody has already said okay, and you're insisting, we recall chapter 23 when Abraham was bargaining with the Hittites over the sale of Machpelah, the cave to bury Sarah in, that Abraham ended up buried in as well, and others along the lineage will be buried in, where it seemed on the surface that something had been resolved, and yet one of the discussion partners continues to argue as if he's not being heard. And that's what we see here, and we'll see behind it what might be the key. So he says, no, please, if I find favor with you, then accept, or literally and take, my present, the minha, which will shift to barakah here, from my hand. Let's look at that before we look at the second part of it. So looking at that here, we go back to the story in Genesis 4. I'm sorry, I really did not have this one prepared before I showed it here, but I'll fix it before the post. So in the course of time, Cain brought to Abel an offering, minha, of the fruit of the ground, and Abel for his part brought of the firstlings of his flock, their fat portions. And Yahweh had regard for Abel and his offering, again minha. And those are the only previous uses of minha in this entire book of Genesis, other than starting right here in this scene, and we'll see it a couple more times. So certainly we're expected to hear that, but what is the connection? So we can see here that part of the issue is that without accepting the offering, it seems there's a breach in the relationship. So Jacob's believing here that unless Esau accepts the present, there is no real relationship. And perhaps that's an attempt to pay him back in a way, or perhaps it's simply just the ritual, since Esau has already said he has enough, and Jacob can see that he has the power to have 400 men. That this isn't just about enriching him. This is about trying to undo what he still feels bad about, the damage he has done that's led to Esau's historical hatred of him. And then he adds this incredible line, for truly to see your face is like seeing the face of God. And here's my note that connects it back to Abel's offering there in the note I was just saying. So here, this is not a direct link back in the sense of using the same words, but certainly to see your face is like seeing the face of God evokes the original creation story in chapter 1. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And so to see any person who is their, as we might say, their true self, not their manipulated self, and not their hiding self, and not their pretend self, not the Jacob as Esau self, but the true self of Jacob, or in this case, the true self of Esau, is to see God. And that would be true for you or for me, for anybody. But it's not said much, and no one else has ever made that claim. And yet we saw just in the previous chapter, Jacob called the place Peniel, saying about the person he wrestled with, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved. So the juxtaposition of to see your face is like seeing the face of God, with just a few verses earlier in the previous chapter, I have seen God face to face, is highlighting the deep, holy intimacy that's at issue here. To recognize that another person's face is like the face of God is to see into them, not to see who they're wanting to be, like in our culture where our faces may be Botoxed or made up or have all kinds of ways to appear to be something other than what we actually are. But the eyes always do give it away, don't they? So to see the face is to look in the eyes, to see favor in your eyes, and to see the truth of what the relationship is about. And that's what Jacob is claiming here, if he's being sincere, if he's not just being flattering, out of fear that Esau is still hostile to him underneath a superficial sense of acceptance. But he says this as the justification here, since you have received me with such favor. Literally, since you are pleased. With such favor is actually not in this form as it is up here with favor, and as we see it another time. So since he sees that he's pleased, he's seeming to accept the idea that Esau is pleased to see him, and that is the sense of seeing the face of God. And it's really quite an amazing thing. What if we read this as the story of two nations, as we saw up here, about the relationship between Israel and Edom? As I noted previously, we don't see in Genesis the direct confrontation between Israel and Edom. We noted last time where we see it in 2 Samuel 8, where David put garrisons in Edom and basically conquered Edom. And we noted in Deuteronomy 23:8 that Edom was an exception from all the Canaanite nations. That Deuteronomy 7 said, you Israelites must destroy them all, or God will destroy you. So Edom was understood as part of the family, although Deuteronomy 23:8 doesn't say how that the Edomites were part of the family. But since David obviously saw them as an enemy to be conquered, the only way it seems that Genesis is suggesting that those nations could be reconciled is to see God in each other's faces, to see each of the peoples as made in the image and likeness of God. And that recalls at one level Genesis 10, where there's the table of nations as 70 nations spread out, and some of them are Israel's friendly allies, and some of them are Israel's enemies, and some of them are empires. But they were all made in the image and likeness of God. So when they're not acting in that, it's hard to see God in them. But here what we're seeing is the way to the reconciliation is for each person or each group to be vulnerably their true self and accept the other exactly as they are, as God accepts us as we are. So we continue down to the last verse of what we're looking at for today. So please accept my gift. And here he switches. And it's really terrible that most translations don't show the surprise that's being unveiled here. It's barakah. He's basically trying to give the blessing back. And you can't do that, of course. Fishbane notes it as a slip of the tongue, an unconscious double entendre through which Jacob confesses his guilt. But it may be that, but it may well be intentional, that he's finally getting out from under the minhah and just naming what's happening, since Esau has otherwise not been willing to accept it. And then he continues, because God has dealt graciously with me, variation on the word chen, meaning favor, that we saw earlier, and then we'll see more of that later. And because now we hear Jacob saying, I have everything. I want isn't there. So we hear the more close parallels where Esau said, I have enough, and Jacob says, I have everything. It's not about his desire. The I want is not there in the Hebrew. So they both have everything, regardless of what Isaac or Rebekah did to skew the balance. And so he urged them, which is an interesting word here, because we hear it back in 19:3 and 9, where Lot, as we see here, urged the angelic visitors to not sleep in the square, but to stay in his house, because the square of a city was such a dangerous place for a stranger to be. And this is not exactly the same thing. Jacob is not urging him to stay with him. In fact, as we'll see in the next video, it's Esau that urges Jacob to stay with him in the sense of journeying alongside, and Jacob will say no. But here, Jacob uses this, or at least the narrator uses the word to describe Jacob's action as a very strong word. As I note on the right, only the other use in Genesis is here and in Genesis 19:3 and 9. And Esau takes it. Why does Esau take it? We can't know, but it seems that he's taking it whether because he's persuaded by what Jacob says, or just out of the generosity that Esau's expressing to just agree with what his brother does. And so, does that mean he took all the 550 animals? Well, we don't hear the details. It just describes it as the gift, as a blessing. Was that still, is it as barakah rather than as minhah still refer to the animals, or is it just symbolically the blessing? You can decide for yourself. And so as we continue in the chapter, we're moving beyond the chiasms and out to the future, where they're going to journey separately, and it will lead to Jacob, exhausted from all the years with Laban and from the stress of anticipating Esau, making his biggest mistake, settling too soon and not completing the route home, and that will lead to disaster. But we'll get there starting in the next video and beyond that. See you then for that. Bye-bye.